I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitchin, and this month we'll be doing blocks 10, 11, and 12 of our Parables quilt along. Block 10 is the Unfruitful Fig Tree, and it finishes at 8 inches. Let's get started.
Let us pray. Great and merciful Father, you are the sower and I am your seed. Let me fall on the path of righteousness and bear fruits that give you glory. Even when evil corrupts me and I become a weed in your garden, you find something worthy in me and save me from the compost heap. I commit my seed into your hands. Sow me as you will. Amen.
Let's take a look at the pattern. Block 10, Unfruitful Fig Tree, is an 8-inch finished block. On page 1, I include the instructions that tell you how to cut your units. And you'll notice that on the pattern, I have 2 shades of green. You could make your leaves then for the tree the same color on both sides. It's entirely up to you. But here in the instructions, I have you cut from 2 fabrics. Then on the first page, it has the parable and a reflection about the parable. On page 2, I have step-by-step instructions, including cutting and pressing. On page 3, I have a little information about why I chose the block fig leaf to represent this block in the quilt, and a place for you to write your personal reflection. Let's take a look at fabric choices. The pattern calls for you to have a background fabric and leaves. You can have the same fabric for both of your leaves if you choose to, or you can have 2 different fabrics. In my case, I chose 2 different fabrics. You should use, for the background, some fabrics that have a pretty small scale or they're a tone on tone. That way the leaves and the fabrics in the leaves will show up. On the leaves themselves, I'd caution you against using directional fabric because you're going to have some units that go diagonal and some that go vertical and horizontal. So sometimes that's difficult to keep track of. In my case here, I've chosen fabrics for both of my different quilts from the same greens, from the same fabric line. And again, that's not necessary. You can choose 2 different fabric lines. You can do whatever you like. You could have 2 shades of green or any other color you chose, but just make sure that the scale on the print is small enough that it will not detract from the actual unit itself. Before doing any of your cutting, make sure that you remove the selvages first. The pattern calls for you to cut units from the background fabric and from 2 different colors of leaves. Since the background fabric has to have twice as much cuts as the leaves, I've placed 2 layers of background on the bottom, and I'll place my leaf fabric on top. Leaf fabric number 1 and leaf fabric number 2. That way I can go ahead and make my cuts and get all of my units for the pattern. The first unit is cut 1.5 by 4.5 inches. So I'll make my cut and then turn my fabric and trim it down to 4.5 inches. When I place my ruler on the fabric, I make sure I have a straight line at the top, the side, and the bottom so that I know my unit is cut the way it is supposed to be cut. I'll do the same for the 3.5-inch unit. The next cut is the 2 5/8-inch squares. And I like to use a ruler. This happens to be a Marty Michelle square ruler that has nice, clear, and distinct 1/8-inch markings. That way I make sure my unit is cut exactly the way it should be. I need 4 of the background fabric, but only 2 of the 2 other fabrics. Again, I make sure that my unit is square on the top, the side, the bottom. That way I know that this cut is square as well. And the last cut is the 3.5-inch square. Again, I just need one of my 2 colors of fabrics, but I need 2 of my background fabric. Two square at the top, the side, the bottom, and I'm ready to make that cut. Step 1 of the pattern asks you to begin by marking a diagonal line on your 2 5/8-inch squares. You will need to mark that on each one of the 2 5/8-inch squares. Now there are 2 methods of doing it. You could easily take a ruler and a chalk or a pencil and mark your diagonal on the wrong side of the fabric. That way you can see the line as you go to sew it on your machine. Or the method that I prefer is to take my square and fold it in half with the wrong sides together. Finger press it first, but then I press it with my iron, and then I will stitch on the pressing line. I find this method is faster than drawing a line, and it also allows me to check each triangle, half square, and make sure that I cut it accurately. If I had not cut it accurately, it would not press well. You would see leftover pieces here. In step 1, you'll be using the background squares that are 3.5 inches, and you'll be placing one of your leaf fabrics in opposite corners. And then I'll stitch diagonally on that line or on the press line, whichever one is the case. It's not necessary to pin as long as you make sure you hold that unit squarely in the corner of the background square. If that's difficult for you to do, go ahead and drop a pin in it. Make sure that you take that pin out before you run it through your machine. You can see that I'm using my 1/4-inch foot, and I've already put a beginner in place so that I don't end up with a little rat's nest underneath my background fabric. So I'll put my square into the machine, and I can just follow this marked line as I stitch. In this case, my line is a pressed line. Before sewing the other side on, I have to make sure that I move that half square out of the way so I don't stitch it underneath this half square. The pattern calls for you first to trim that seam to a 1/4 inch. I like to use a ruler that has a nice thin 1/4 inch line that I can place directly on the seam and trim with my rotary cutter. And yes, you could just trim this with a pair of scissors, but I find that usually my 1/4 inch trim is not as accurate and the block doesn't look as clean on the back side. The pattern calls for you to press these units to the outside. First, finger press them to the outside so that they are seated in place before setting your iron in place for 5 seconds. I like to use a dry iron. Introducing steam at this point would introduce stretch into my block, and I don't want to do that. The unfinished unit should measure 3.5 inches, and mine does. Then I can set it aside and move on to the next steps. Step 2 of the pattern is the same as step 1. The difference is you'll be using your leaf fabric as backgrounds and your background fabric in the half square units. Trim 1/4 inch, just as we did in step 1. Always making sure that those half squares have not overlapped each other because you don't want to cut them off. Finger press that unit open before pressing the seam with a hot iron for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 3.5 inches, and I check my measurements before I move on. Step 3 calls for you to add a 3.5-inch strip to the left side of a diagonal unit from step 1 or step 2. You're to match the color of the fabric that's in the diagonal. So for this particular block, it's pretty easy. It's my dark fig leaf, so I have the dark fabric here, which means that the other piece will eventually go right here. But the question is, on the fabric that has both a dark and a light, how do you know where to place the 3.5-inch unit and where to place the 4.5-inch unit? The answer is quite simple. You turn the unit and lay it out as it will lay out on your final block. You can see that I match the half square with the color of the fig leaf from the previous block. So in this case, it's my dark fig leaf. I have my dark half square in this corner, which means that my 3.5-inch unit will go here and my 4.5-inch unit will go here. So I like to lay them out so I can see them before I stitch these 3.5-inch units in place. I'll flip it over like a sandwich and stitch 1/4 inch down this side. The pattern calls for you to press this rectangle to the outside, and I do that by first setting the seam with some heat and then pressing it to the outside, holding my iron in place for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 3.5 by 4.5 inches, and I double check all my measurements before I go on to the next step. The pattern calls for you to stitch the 4.5-inch unit to the unit from step 3. For my dark green leaf, it will go at the top of the unit. For my background fabric, it will go at the bottom of the unit. I fold them over like a sandwich and run it through my machine. The pattern calls for you to press this 4.5-inch rectangle to the outside. So first you set the seam and then hold the iron in place for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 4.5-inch square, and I double check my measurements before I move on. So now you should have what looks like an arrow out of the background fabric and an arrow out of your leaf fabrics. Step 5 calls for you to stitch them together. Before I stitch them together, I once again take a look at them to make sure that I'm matching up my fabric colors here. And if that is the case, I just fold it over like a sandwich. And you can pin this in place by pinning both edges before running it through your machine at 1/4 inch. Step 5 of the pattern calls for you to press this seam open. You're going to have some bulk in areas, particularly where these seams are pressed to the outside. So it's important to finger press that first before setting your hot iron on it for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure 4.5 by 8.5 inches, and I check my measurements before I move on to the final step. Step 6 of the pattern calls for you to stitch the 2 units together, matching your center seam. I like to lay them out on my mat first and make sure all my blocks are in the right location before I stitch them together. Once you stitch them, the pattern calls for you to press this seam open. And again, you do that just by using a hot iron with no steam. Just like before in step 5, you're going to have some bulk here at those junctures. So go ahead and just press them nice and evenly. The unfinished block should measure 8.5-inch square, so I like to use a squaring tool and double check my measurements before I set it aside and move on to my next block. I like to stitch 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch around the edge of the block to keep it nice and square, so that while I'm handling it many times throughout this block of the month, I'll be able to make sure it stays nice and square. And there you have block 10 of our parable series, Unfruitful Fig Tree. If you have any questions along the way, give me a call, send me an email, send a message, and someone will get back to you right away. Thanks and have a blessed day.